I used to work the graveyard shift at a hospital. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but I needed the money. I'd spend my nights wandering the halls, checking on patients, and trying not to fall asleep on my feet. One night, I got a call from the emergency room. They needed me to come down and help with a patient who had just been brought in. I didn't think anything of it at first, but as I made my way down to the emergency room, I started to feel uneasy. The hallway was eerily quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. When I got to the emergency room, I found the staff clustered around a gurney. The patient was covered in blood and moaning in pain. The doctors and nurses were frantically trying to save his life, but it was clear that he was fading fast. Suddenly, the patient sat up, his eyes wild with fear. He started screaming, thrashing around on the gurney. The staff tried to restrain him, but he was too strong. He broke free and ran down the hallway, leaving a trail of blood behind him. I followed him, trying to keep up, but he was moving too fast. I could hear him screaming, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. It was like he was speaking in another language. I chased him through the hospital, down dark, deserted hallways and into empty rooms. Each time I caught up to him, he would slip away, disappearing into the shadows. As I pursued him, I began to notice strange things happening around me. The lights would flicker and dim, and I would hear strange noises coming from the walls. Sometimes, it felt like something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. Finally, I found myself in the hospital's abandoned wing. It was a place that no one went, a relic from an earlier time, when the hospital had been much smaller. As I stepped inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. I heard a noise behind me and spun around, but no one was there. I turned back around and saw the patient standing in front of me. He was covered in blood, and looked like he was on the brink of death. I tried to talk to him, to ask him what was wrong, but he just stared at me with blank eyes. As I stood there, trying to figure out what to do next, I heard a whisper in my ear. It was so faint that I could barely make out the words, but I knew what it was saying. "Get out." I turned around, but there was no one there. I looked back at the patient, but he was gone too. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I spun around, ready to fight. But there was no one there. I was alone in the abandoned wing, with nothing but the sound of my own breathing to keep me company. I knew then that something was wrong with the hospital, that there was something dark and sinister lurking in its halls. I quit my job the next day and never looked back. Years later, I heard that the hospital had been shut down due to a series of unexplained deaths and disappearances. No one knows for sure what happened there, but I have my suspicions. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can still hear the patient's screams echoing in my mind, and I wonder what really happened in that hospital. I've always been a bit uneasy about hospitals, but I never imagined anything like this could happen. It started with a routine visit to the emergency room for what I thought was a simple infection. I was admitted to a room and left to wait for the doctor. But as the hours ticked by, I began to feel more and more uneasy. The room was dimly lit and eerily quiet, with only the occasional sound of a machine beeping or a nurse shuffling down the hall. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but my mind kept wandering to the strange feeling that something wasn't quite right. As the night wore on, my condition worsened and I started to feel feverish and disoriented. The nurses seemed to be avoiding me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was going on. I tried to call for help, but my voice was hoarse and barely audible. Then, in the early hours of the morning, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure dressed in scrubs and a surgical mask appeared in the doorway, silently beckoning me to follow. I hesitated for a moment, but the urgency of my illness overrode my fear. I followed the figure down a series of dark and winding hallways, until we reached a door marked restricted area, authorized personnel only. The figure pushed the door open and motioned for me to enter. Inside, I was met with a scene that still haunts me to this day. There were rows of beds, each occupied by a patient who appeared to be in a catatonic state. Machines beeped and whirred in the background, and a pungent smell hung in the air. The figure led me to a bed in the corner of the room, where I was met with the sight of a doctor performing a grotesque procedure on a patient. I couldn't bear to watch, and I stumbled backwards in horror. That's the last thing I remember, before waking up in a different room, with no memory of how I got there. I was discharged soon after, and I never found out what happened to me that night. But I know one thing for certain: I'll never set foot in a hospital again. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I couldn't remember where I was or how I had gotten there. Looking around, I realized that I was in a hospital room. The walls were a pale blue color, and the room was dimly lit. I couldn't see anyone else in the room with me. As I tried to sit up, I realized that I was strapped to the bed. Panic set in as I struggled against the restraints. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what was going on. Was I in some kind of coma? Had I been kidnapped and brought here against my will? Just then, the door to the room opened, and a nurse walked in. She had a cold, stern expression on her face, and I immediately felt a chill run down my spine. "Good morning," she said in a monotone voice. "I see you're awake. Where am I?" "You're in the hospital," she replied. "You were brought here last night after a car accident." I tried to remember the accident, but my mind was foggy. I couldn't recall anything about it. "What happened to me?" I asked. "You have some injuries," she said, walking over to the side of the bed. "We need to keep you here for observation." As she checked my vitals, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hospital felt eerie and sinister, and the nurse's demeanor was unsettling. Over the next few days, I was visited by various doctors and nurses. They all seemed cold and distant, and none of them would answer my questions about what was going on. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard strange noises coming from the hallway. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy object across the floor. I tried to ignore it, but the noise grew louder and more persistent. Suddenly, the door to my room burst open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a man in a lab coat, but there was something off about him. His eyes were cold and calculating, and he had a sinister smirk on his face. "Hello there," he said in a menacing tone. "How are you feeling?" "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to free myself from the restraints. "I'm Dr. Williams," he replied. "I'm in charge of your care." Something about him didn't feel right. I tried to scream for help, but no sound came out of my mouth. Dr. Williams leaned in close, his breath hot on my face. "You're going to be here for a while," he said. "But don't worry, we'll take good care of you." Over the next few weeks, I became increasingly convinced that something sinister was going on in the hospital. Strange experiments were being conducted on patients, and I was one of them. I tried to gather evidence and reach out to anyone who could help, but I was met with resistance at every turn. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a commotion outside my room. I strained to listen, and I heard the sounds of a struggle and muffled voices. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a group of people rushed in, led by a woman in a black suit. "Are you okay?" she asked, helping me out of the restraints. I nodded, still in shock. "We've been investigating this hospital for months," she explained. "We suspected that they were conducting illegal experiments on patients. We finally have enough evidence to shut them down." As we rushed out of the hospital, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had escaped from the clutches of the sinister doctors and nurses, and I was finally free.